All right, ready to rumble? Try it?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. Are you interested in the craft of writing?
Curious about the writing and publishing lives of fascinating Canadian authors?
Excited by a cracking good sentence or two?
If so, you're tuned to the right frequency.
Welcome to the new season of Further Reading, a podcast produced by the University of King's College MFA program.
I'm your co-host, Aaron Williams.
And I'm your other co-host, R.C. Shaw.
We're both graduates of the King's MFA and authors of 2 books of creative nonfiction.
More importantly, we surf together, read together, and we're always talking about what it takes to get a creative idea down on paper and out into the world.
That's why we've invited some fine Canadian wordsmiths to sit down and share their thoughts on the writing life.
We're stoked you could join us to hear these lively conversations.
So kick back with your tea.
Or do some dishes.
Or keep jogging.
And enjoy this episode of Further Reading. Hey, how's it going, Aaron?
Good, RC. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well.
Right on. I'm excited about today's episode. You want to talk a little bit more about who's coming in?
Love to. It's Elliott Gish, and Elliott Gish wants to creep you out. A writer and librarian from Halifax, Nova Scotia, she grew up on a steady diet of Tamora Pierce books, trashy teen rom-coms, and bad pop punk. She loves all of those things to this day. Elliott is a 2020 graduate of the Fraser University Writers Studio program, where she was mentored by Jen Sookfong Lee and Paul Headrick. Her debut novel, Grey Dog, was published by ECW Press in early 2024. She lives in Halifax's North End with her partner and, when not writing, spends her time watching too many sitcoms and reading too many listicles.
Okay, awesome. Let's check it out. Here's Elliott Gish.
Elliott Gish, welcome to Further Reading. Congratulations on the publication of Grey Dog. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I wanted to start with a question that comes from your acknowledgements. And I read the first line and I thought, oh, that's really interesting that you've been thinking about the acknowledgements to your first novel since you were 8 years old. Mm-hmm. So would you mind painting a picture of your origins as a writer and how that kind of led up to your first novel? Or maybe even just an interesting story from your early writing days.
Certainly. So I first realized that I wanted to be a writer, like it says in my acknowledgements, back when I was 8 years old, when I won a poetry contest put on through Halifax Public Libraries, actually. So link up there because I work for Halifax Public Libraries now. It was a poem that was a blatant ripoff of Jack Prelutsky because I'd heard his poem, Boring Day. And I wrote a poem that was very much like that called Boring Day. And I guess the librarians had just never heard of Jack Prelutsky because I won for the 3rd grade competition. And they had a little reception for all the writers who had won this competition. And they got to read their work in front of a room full of people. And I remember looking up while I was doing that at just this rapt sea of faces just watching me. And, in hindsight, they were just being very polite at, the cute 8-year-old reading her silly little poem. But I was like, oh, this is a dangerous feeling. This is something that I want to feel again and again and again. And it wasn't until after that I really started writing fiction when I was younger. And it was all terrible, terrible fiction. Like I used to sneak my mother's Reader's Digest books that were all, very dishy, like domestic stories full of, cheating and affairs and violence and whatnot. And I tried to write things that were very much like that. And as I recall, my mother found one of them at one point, and it was a ripoff of some Reader's Digest story about an abusive relationship. And I tried to write something very much like that. And she kind of took me aside and she's like, are you okay? Like, why are you writing this? Like, where are you getting this? It's like, I learned it from reading your books, Mom.
What's the same and what's different about writing horror versus, say, other genres?
Mm-hmm. Pretty much the big difference is in a lot of different genres, an unhappy ending isn't necessarily the norm or encouraged. But I think it is very much the norm in horror. And I think that there's a certain truth to that that's really compelling for me. That, I do love a happy ending if it's earned, but so often they're not. And so often an ending that's either grim or at least a little bit muddled and a little bit more mixed as an ending is more true to life, I think.
Yeah.
I say that, having written a book all about, scary monsters living in the woods. So, true to life in quotation marks.
And you put a teacher there. And I'm a teacher myself, and I really read this book with that hat on, thinking, oh, this teacher is losing her mind, or is she? There's some resonance for me as a teacher. Why teachers in your stories, and have you taught in the past, and what's your interest in the teacher?
I haven't taught in the past, actually, although I think growing up it was thought by at least some members of my family that teaching is probably the only thing that I would ever be good for, because I didn't have any practical skills. I just read a lot of books. And, my parents looking at that probably thought, oh, well, she's going to have to be a teacher then. But for Grey Dog, the reason why I was interested in teaching as a profession is because it was one of the very, very few ways that women could actually earn a living in a respectable way. You could be a teacher, you could be a governess of some kind, although by this period of history, governesses were kind of out of vogue. There really wasn't very much that you could do to earn an independent living. And teaching being one of those things, I was really interested in the kind of impact that would have if you were somebody going into teaching because that was the only career that was open to you, and, in order for you to keep your social status. If you weren't necessarily cut out to be a teacher, if it wasn't necessarily something that you were really passionate about. And I think that was probably the case for a lot of women in this time period, is that they taught because they weren't really allowed to do anything else, but they didn't necessarily like teaching. They didn't necessarily enjoy the company of their students. They may not even have liked children at all, but it was the only thing that they could do. And I find that so interesting. And I think there are probably still a lot of people in the teaching profession who maybe kind of fell into it or don't necessarily have that passion that you kind of need in order to pull through. And that's really interesting too.
It is.
Yeah.
And just to follow that with a little L.M. Montgomery side note, which I learned from you, that she did some teaching. But did not necessarily like it.
Yeah, no, she didn't like it at all. Ellen Montgomery is just such a fascinating figure in Canadian literature because she looms so large, but her output is so different from her actual life. Because I feel like if you read especially the Anne books that are very, very light and very, very wholesome and very winsome, Anne does find teaching very fulfilling, and she does really enjoy it, and she loves interacting with her students. Whereas if you read Montgomery's journals from around the time that she was a teacher, they are full of complaints about the kids that she's teaching. They're full of complaints about her living situations, complaints about the people who live in the villages where she's teaching. She had a lot of opinions, did old Lucy. And that was another thing that really inspired me for this book, was learning more about Montgomery's life, because I've always loved her work. Like when I was a child, the Emily books were my everything. I read them over and over again because they were the first books that really gave me an understanding of how to be a writer as a woman and how to sort of come to that understanding of yourself where writing is sort of has this prime place in your heart and in your soul. And so they were very, very important to me. And then reading later about Ellen Montgomery's life and how difficult in many ways it was. Like she was a wealthy woman. She had, a lot of social clout as the wife of a minister. She had a lot going for her, but she also suffered with depression. Her husband had a lot of mental health issues that, of course, it being the times, like they weren't addressed. They just, took a lot of benzos about it, basically. She had a son who was a bit of a pest to all the maids in the house. She was originally very, very religiously devout, but ended up losing her faith, especially after the First World War. Just a really fascinating person with a lot of really interesting, complicated contradictions in her life. And that was one of the prime inspirations for Ada. Like not only the idea that you could have this person whose output is so sunny and so wholesome, who has this very dark life, but the idea of taking a heroine who could have been the protagonist of one of her books, one of those very light, wholesome books, and dropping her in the middle of a horror story.
That's great.
Talking about Montgomery, and that sounds like an early big one on your favorite authors. What was sort of the progression after that? Did anybody sort of match Montgomery's place in your pantheon?
Well, I've already talked a little bit about Tamora Pierce,
Yeah.
whose influence I don't think you can necessarily see on my work. I don't think it really is out there very much. But she was definitely an early influence just because she was one of the few YA and children's fantasy authors who always centered young girls and women in her fiction. And that was, I didn't really know that you could do that at the time because, of course, I'd read Tolkien and Chronicles of Narnia and things like that, where girls were always sort of like shunted to the side. I mean, in Lord of the Rings, you have Éowyn, and then Arwen's out there somewhere doing something we don't really know what, and that's just about it. Chronicles of Narnia, all the girls kind of get sidelined after a certain amount of time. But Tamora Pierce was one of the first authors who kept all of her female characters sort of front and center and participating in the action. And, they were becoming knights and waving swords around and stuff, and I loved that.
And how old are you roughly when you're going deep into...
Oh, gosh. I think I was 10 or so when I read my first Tamora Pierce book, and she kept a hold on me for years and years and years. And I suppose all of the authors that I really got into when I was younger can't necessarily see their influence on my work now, because another one was actually Terry Pratchett, who writes, comic fantasy. It's that fantasy thing again. But he came to his books with a real sense of moral clarity and outrage and anger that I really enjoyed, because so many of his books are about, class war and regular war and racism and sexism, and he addresses all these concepts with this very light, humorous touch, but there's this deep well of anger underneath it. And I really love authors where you can always feel that anger sort of beneath the surface. That's something that I really like to sort of pick out in authors' works.
So you took your imagination and wrestled it down into this beautiful packaged book, but there would have been some messy steps between that first draft and what we see in front of us. I'd love to know what you found to be one of the more challenging aspects of the editing process. Challenging or fulfilling, but how do you feel about editing?
I'm very pro editing. I definitely need a very firm editor for my work, because otherwise I end up running madly off in all directions. This book originally had a bunch of different subplots that did not make it into the final product. One of them, there was a very long subplot at one point about the Christmas pageant that occurs in the book. There were just pages and pages of describing who was going to play what, and all the domestic drama surrounding this Christmas pageant, and this student didn't want to play this character, and this one didn't want to play this one, and I reread it, I think, like 3 drafts, and it was like, why on earth am I talking so much about this? Nobody cares. Everybody's seen a Christmas pageant. Nobody cares enough to listen to all this drama about who gets to play Mary and who's relegated to playing a wise man. Nobody's going to care about that. So that was something that I did need a bit of a firm editing hand, reining in.
But was that your own hand, or was that I think it was Jen
Sookfong Lee? Yes, it was both of us. I think I had snipped most of it by the time she got a look at the draft that I sent her, but there were still some lingering snippets of that subplot in there that needed to be pruned. There was also another subplot where I tried to delve really deep into a minor character's mother and how she might have been one of the people who could hear the gray dog in the woods, and that ended up going on for a good 10,000 words, and it really, it was too much. It was too much, so that had to go as well. So I'm very, very pro editors. I definitely need an editor for all of my work. I'm not one of those people who can just, fart out a book and have it be perfect right from the get. I don't think any of us are. I think authors who say that are probably lying, to be honest.
Absolutely.
How big did this get word count wise? Do you remember?
I think at its longest, and this was one of the early drafts that I didn't send anybody, it was about, it might have been 150,000 words. So there was a lot that had to go. There was a lot that I had to snip out there, but it all needed to go. It was,
What did you end at, just to give listeners an idea?
I believe the end word count is around 108,000. So there's quite a bit that got snipped out, and it needed to.
And you were talking about Terry Pratchett, to go back to him for a second. Also, did you go to Memorial?
I did.
And did you take English there?
I sure did.
I went to MUN as well, and I graduated in 2012. But I remember there was a professor there, Chris Lockett, who was really into Terry Pratchett. Did you ever have him?
I never took his class.
Oh, okay,
no.
that's too. I'm not sure.
No,
if it would have been your thing, but was there any sort of awakenings there as far as, I mean, it sounds like you were on your way since you were 8 and you were obviously already writing and stuff. What happened during your undergrad that sort of pushed you along or changed directions or anything?
Well, to be honest, it was in the last years of my undergrad that I stopped writing, because it was around that time that I entered into a relationship that ended up being quite toxic and quite abusive, and I wasn't able to write when I was in that space because the person that I was in a relationship with, she did not want me to. So I just sort of had to stop for a long time. And it was during that long period of, I almost think of it as like a period of convalescence almost, sort of taking a break from writing, those 5 years where I didn't write almost at all. And then when I picked up my pen again, or, metaphorically, when I sat down at my computer again, I found that I was a very different person than I was when I had stopped writing when I was 22 or so, and my work was entirely different. There were a few writers that I was exposed to when I was doing my undergrad that still make a huge impact on me, like
for sure,
Disappearing Moon Cafe by Sky Lee. That was one book that really sort of changed my life. I also read Beautiful Losers by Leonard Cohen around that time. That's one of those books that makes you look at it and think, oh, so you're allowed to do all this stuff. I didn't know that you were allowed to break the rules in this way. It's not necessarily a pleasant read, but it's a very, very eye-opening one. And of course, I took some classes on, the Victorian writers, read a lot of Dickens. And that was really interesting to me, too, to see what worked in his books, like still after all these years, and what where the mind started to drift off a little bit, which is very helpful for me while writing Grey Dog, because it helped me sort of lean into those instincts of here's where you can get a little bit florid and a little bit Victorian about it, and here's where you need to sort of snip before people stop listening.
And I found that about Ada's journals, the voice that she had really fit that 1901 specific voice in my head. How did it feel writing without contractions like that for so long? I really do appreciate the style that you carried through there. Did that come naturally, or is that something you worked into through drafting?
It did feel very natural, actually, because so many of the authors that I read when I was very young and very impressionable, it was people like Montgomery, Louisa May Alcott, Lewis Carroll, all the quote-unquote classics. And so it felt very natural to write in that style in a way that, maybe should concern me a little bit. Kind of like, there was one time fairly recently where I realized that too much of that era still has a very firm hold on me. I was dressing up for Halloween and I happened to find, a pioneer-style gown and bonnet. And I was like, oh, this will be really funny. It'll be funny for me to show up to work wearing this. And I put it on and I looked in the mirror. I was like, oh, no, this feels right. I want to wear a bonnet all the time. And I think, like, in my heart of hearts, I am just a person who wants to wear a bonnet all the time. And I just have to deal with that, That's just who I am as a person.
Love it. I just have another question about the publication of the book. Did anything unexpected happen after the book was out there?
Well, people read it. And I was not expecting that, to be perfectly honest. I think one thing that I'm still reeling about is that Kelly Link read it. And she's an author that I absolutely adore. And not only did she read it, but she liked it and she blurbed it. And I'm still not, I haven't come down from that high yet, I don't think. I may never. So that was really extraordinary to realize that I could write something that somebody whose work I respect so much could also enjoy. And it's, anytime that I'm feeling a little down on myself, I'm just like, remember, Elliott, Kelly Link read your book. And realizing, too, I didn't realize this until the book was out, but there is a sneaky, thriving horror scene in Nova Scotia, in Halifax particularly. There are more horror authors in this province, in this city, than I'd ever expected. There's Tiff Morris, of course, who I think... Have you both met Tiffany?
No.
Oh, she's amazing. She wrote a book called Green Fuse Burning. It's like an eco-horror novella. And she also wrote a book of horror poems, which is a really interesting sort of mixture of forms. But there's also Peter Counter, who wrote horror fiction and nonfiction. There's Brittany Bryn. There's Sarah L. Hawthorne. All kinds of authors of horror fiction in this province who I didn't even know existed until the book came out and they started getting in touch with me. And that was just really wonderful to see, because I feel like sometimes you feel like almost as though the literary scene in Nova Scotia in general is just all stories about, oh, my dad went down into the coal mines.
Yeah.
And that's fine. It is totally fine to write stories about dads going down in coal mines and whatnot, but that's never been something that I've been particularly interested in writing, never something that's called to me. And so I did feel for a little while like, is this something that as somebody from Nova Scotia I am allowed to write? Or do I need to write a story about dad going down into the coal mines or out to sea, or I guess these days, moving to Calgary or whatnot? Yeah. So it was nice to almost get permission after the fact, realizing that there are other people here who are writing this as well.
Yeah. Speaking of lows, during the writing of Grey Dog, what was a low for you?
Goodness. I think anytime a writer sits down at a project and reads it over, there's a bit of a low there, because the things that you thought were so brilliant at the time that you were writing them maybe turn out to be not so brilliant, or this plot twist that you figured nobody would ever see coming. You're like, oh, you actually signaled that like 5 pages into the book, so you maybe need to breadcrumb that a little bit better. But one of the real lows for me during the process of finishing the book actually came during the editing process. And it was more of a personal low than a writing low, really. But it was when I was working on the edits for one of the final drafts. I thought it was the final draft at the time. It turned out not to be. There were another, I think, 3 drafts after that, something like that. But when I was working on the edits for that draft, my youngest sister actually passed away. And of course, it was a very difficult time for my whole family. But it was very odd to try to get back into the editing process after that and remember, oh, right, I wrote a whole book about somebody struggling with the death of a younger sister, and realizing how much that impacts her everyday life and how she thinks that she's fine, and then suddenly there's something that she'll remember, or a memory that will bubble up, or something that will smell like her sister or remind her of her sister in some way, and suddenly she's not fine at all. It was very eerie to read back over that draft and see all these sections where I'm talking about that and think, wow, I didn't even know how this felt at the time. But somehow I did know. It was very strange. That's who the book is dedicated to. It's my youngest sister, Kale, who died in 2022. Oh,
wow. That's recent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So when you went back and looked at that stuff, did you change quite a bit of it? Like, were you able to, was that any sort of cathartic thing for you, was going back to that?
I deepened it, I would say. Like those moments where Ada talks about her sister Flory, I let her sit in them for a little bit longer, because I hadn't realized when I first wrote the draft how much you're actually going to be sitting in those feelings and how much it impacts your entire life.
She is throughout.
She is throughout,
end, which seems, a good homage, one of many, I'm sure. That, Yeah. Well, that's a different kind of low point than I was expecting. But you took some time after that?
I did, yes. Yeah. And I made sure to take my time going through.
I guess several months.
It took a couple of months to go through that draft to really be able to look at everything that I'd written. But it was a helpful part of the process, not only because it gave me something to do, which is always helpful when you're grieving, but because it gave me a way to grapple with that grief in a way that was both of myself but not of myself. I was thinking about grief and I was writing about grief, but I wasn't writing about myself, because at the time I think it was too raw for me to really face what had happened from my own perspective. So being able to approach it from the perspective of another person was really, really helpful.
Were you writing at all at that time, Elliott?
There is a Google Doc that still exists on my drive. That's just me writing down random thoughts that I had on the first few days after my sister's death. I think I kept at it for about a month. Just there's no order to it. I have not neatened it up at all. It's just, here's a thought that I have about death and grief. I wrote that down, closed the document. Here's another thought, wrote it down, closed the document. And I haven't looked at that document since the last time I wrote in it. I'm a little afraid to be honest. But that was
Sure,
the
yeah.
only way that I could really make sense of those thoughts at that time, is just to write them down, try to get them out of my head that way, and then close the document, not think about them again.
It's a beautiful inscription to the book.
Oh, thank you.
And another type of inscription, this is my tattoo question I have for you, because I learned recently that you may have tattooed the cover or the cover art. What do you love about the cover art, and is that too personal of a question to answer?
Oh, goodness, no, not at all. Yeah, the cover art, I got about 6 or 7 different covers, like cover options, when they were first talking about how to sell the book and how to present it. And they were all gorgeous. Like, a lot of them were very sort of pastoral looking, lots of like flowers and woodland scenes, and they were all beautiful. But as soon as I saw the image that's on the cover now, the deer turning into the wolf, I was like, that's what it's got to be, because it was so arresting. Like, it was the first one that made me stop and think, oh my God, like, would I pick up that book if I saw it on a shelf? I think I would. So I knew almost as soon as I saw this image that I wanted it on my body. So I went to a local tattoo artist named Charlotte Brumwell. She goes by Gin Wolf on Instagram, so everybody look her up. And asked her if she would tattoo it on me, and now it's on my leg forever.
And that begs a question. After your 10th novel...
I'm going to run out of space.
That's great. So for the setting of Grey Dog, you've created a town and you've centered it around a river. I'm curious, did you have the setting pictured in your mind before you really got going, or did you write into it? How was the planning stages before you really got this story moving?
So this is embarrassing, but the setting of Grey Dog, Lowry Bridge, is based almost entirely on a camp that I went to as an 11-year-old called King's Landing. It is a historical reenactment camp that I went to when I was 11, and I got to run around wearing a bonnet and an apron, and I had the time of my life there. And it made a huge impression on me, because that was the first time that I'd, been able to do all my dorky history stuff, surrounded by people who also love to do dorky history stuff. It was a very, very freeing week for me as a child. And that was the place that I was thinking of when I wrote Grey Dog, and the place that was very fresh in my mind when I was writing Lowry Bridge. Almost the entire layout of the town is based on that summer camp.
Right, you didn't have to invent much. It was all
mostly
from memory. Okay.
Yeah, it was mostly from memory. The schoolhouse,
Is this camp
the
still
Greer
going
House. It is, yes.
Are you a counselor or anything?
No, I wish.
And then I was also curious, when Ada gets really gross and grimy at the end. That was pretty disgusting.
Thank you.
How did you go about making it so disgusting? Did you experiment with going unshowered for several weeks, or observe somebody?
Not
like
around
that?
the time that I wrote the book.
No.
But during my undergrad, in my first year, I had a period where I have a history of depression, and at the time I was in the middle of a bit of a, let's say, a dark period of mental health, and I just stopped showering. And I didn't even notice that I'd stopped showering. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like what Ada does. But I just, it felt like it would have taken so much energy to get out of bed and go into the shower, and I just couldn't do it. And so I just didn't for, I think, almost 2 weeks. It was really, really gross. I didn't get as gross as Ada does, but I got pretty stinky.
Yeah.
And I thought that would be a good way of indicating not only that her mental health is slipping and that she isn't really able to take care of herself in the way that she was, but also that she's becoming a bit like a wild thing. Like, animals don't bathe.
Totally.
Yeah. And she's becoming more and more animalistic as the story goes on. And
For
so
sure.
why should she care about maintaining hygiene and, making sure that she smells all sweet and flowery like a lady ought to, Like, in her mind, what's the point?
Yeah, that was handled really well, I thought. The sort
so.
of slow slipping. I think that it looked challenging from sort of like putting on my critical reading hat. I was like, I don't know the first thing about trying to document somebody's descent into madness and have it sort of land. So how much effort went in on your part?
Quite a bit. I think in the early drafts, it was way too sudden of a falling off. Like she's scared and she's nervous, and then all of a sudden she's, fully embracing the gray dog and sort of running wild. And I really needed to step it back a little bit there and just make sure that she gets there in these incremental steps where she's terrified, and then she's terrified but also a little bit intrigued. And then she's slowly moving from terrified into just interested in this thing in the woods that's calling for her. I really needed to make sure that it happened very gradually. The old story about put a frog in a pot of boiling water, it'll jump out. But Ada really needed to be immersed in this atmosphere and have the heat slowly turned up so that she wouldn't immediately think, well, I'm going to get the train out of here because to heck with this. It needed to be a sort of gradual slipping.
Right. I
of
didn't
her
even
mind.
think about the fact that, she could have caught herself if, that you could have gone that way, but you didn't, obviously. And
well, then there's no story.
Well, yeah,
she
totally.
just
But if that stuff is weak, I feel like as a reader, you're going, well, why don't you just leave? But it didn't seem like an option to me as a reader.
Yeah, and that's something that you always have to kind of address with horror stories, especially if it's any kind of like haunted place in particular, like whether that's a house or the woods or whatnot. You always have to address, like, why wouldn't a character leave? Like, and in this case, Ada's been there long enough that, she's a little bit entrenched in the community, but also her relationship with her family is not good. She can't return to her father's home by the end of the book. There's nobody in town that she can turn to for help because she's alienated everybody through her behavior. There is no option for her. And of course, she doesn't really have any money, which is another thing that you really need to consider when you're writing women's stories from this time period, is most of them didn't have any money and couldn't have money. And so there was no way for her to leave Lowry Bridge once she gets really thoroughly entrenched there. And even just the mechanics of leaving the town and getting to a train station, you have to get somebody to drive you, and you have to explain why you're leaving, and you have to, justify abandoning your job and abandoning all of your students. So it really is easier almost for Ada to stay and go mad than to leave Lowry Bridge.
And that I really like about the setting. It makes me feel like this fits in Canadian lit really well because the woods come alive, and that your character Ada is drawn to the woods. Are you drawn to the woods? Do you enjoy getting out there, getting lost?
I'm drawn to them and I'm terrified of them is the easiest way to put it. I do find nature fascinating, although I don't tend to be out in it very much. I'm more of an indoor cat myself. But I'm also always cognizant when I'm in nature that, as beautiful as it can be and as gentle as it can seem, it is red in tooth and claw. Like there is nothing about the natural world that's gentle or even has our, best interests at heart, really. Like it's a very sort of amoral kind of setting, which is really interesting to me because I feel like it's easy for us all to feel as though we naturally fit into a natural setting. But there are things in it that want to eat us, things in it that we want to eat. It's a very gory, very grim kind of thing, nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I thought about how people would, like you're saying, how they would view nature back then. And there was sort of I feel like I would imagine a lingering sort of suspicion of, things were being cataloged, but maybe not entirely, that you could hear about, some sort of creature in the woods. And depending on where you lived and stuff, you could very well, people still think there's stuff out there.
Absolutely,
and I'm sure there must have been way more people back then.
Absolutely, yeah.
Just before we wrap it up, Elliott, love to ask for some advice to any aspiring writers out there, if you're up for offering it, or what might you say is a good tidbit for someone who wants to write a novel like this?
My advice always is to follow your weirdest obsessions. Whatever odd little niche of history or culture you're interested in, lean into that and really explore it and let it guide what you're writing. Don't think that you have to write exactly what everybody else is writing, and don't think that you have to change your own voice to, fit whatever is currently trendy or whatever is currently selling, because by the time you get the book published, it's all going to be changed anyway. Like the same thing that sells in like this year won't be the thing that sells 2 years from now. So you may as well just write exactly what you please and exactly what you're passionate about.
Thank you
But also don't spend too much time on Christmas pageants.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming into the studio today. And Aaron, any last words from you?
No, thanks, Elliott. That was fantastic. Further Reading is produced by the University of King's College MFA program, overseen by the great Gillian Turnbull. I edit it, Aaron Williams, that's me. Music is by Pete Johnson. Graphics are by Mike Smith. On the other side of the room from me is
R.C. Shaw over here.
Thanks a lot. We'll talk again soon.